This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to revisit an issue that we discussed more than 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago on this podcast, and an issue that we've been remiss in following up on. It's central to so many experiences, challenges, and potential opportunities in our democracy. It's the question of how we as a society should address issues of sexual assault that are all too common and prevalent in our society, what we're doing to understand the problem, and what we're doing to try to address the problem, especially in some of our cities and other parts of our communities. We're joined today by two people who have spent more time thinking about these issues and acting on addressing these issues than anyone that I know, and that is Hanna Senko and Alison Alter. Hanna is a sexual assault survivor whose case was closed by exceptional clearance by the Austin Police Department, which is another way of saying her case was not investigated. She now serves as a survivor, speaker, writer, and advocate fighting for change in the understanding, reporting, and handling of sex crimes. And she was on our podcast 3 years ago to discuss these issues. Hanna, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back.
And we also have Alison Alter, who is Mayor Pro Tem of Austin, Texas, and City Council person for District 10, among other things, and among many other things, I can tell you personally. Alison has led city efforts to improve the adjudication and prosecution of sexual assault cases with greater respect for sexual assault survivors. And there has actually been some recent progress that Alison is largely responsible for in city policy, and she will talk about that a little bit on the podcast. She is also Zachary's mother and my wife. Alison, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we will start, as always, with Zachary's scene-setting poem here. Zachary, what's the title of your poem this week?
Around the Corner.
I like the title. Let's hear it.
You spent your Saturday tearing into the cupboards looking for the letters you wrote to yourself, the notes you left in a scrawled pen, pacing. You spent your Saturday, maybe in a park, maybe in a restaurant, thinking of the power, is it fleeting, of what lurks around the corner. You turn the corner, maybe it opens onto a promenade, or a bazaar, or a farmer's market on an asphalt pavilion. You turn the corner, maybe it is bright out there in the world, or it's foggy, or there's snow falling on the frozen ground. You turn the corner, and each one, like hinges glued together, opens onto another, and again onto another, in on itself, until you can no longer see where you started, until you can't tell anymore whether you've turned the corner or simply been standing in place for 5 years. You spent your Saturday tearing into the back of the cupboards, opening up old wounds in the sides of your walls, gashes, scratches, maybe they are memories, looking for the letters you wrote to yourself. To this future you who made it around the corner, when you were bent over, looking at the floor, trying to separate today from tomorrow. You spent your Saturday, maybe in a park, maybe in a restaurant, trying to turn a corner. This time you are sure it opens onto a wide expanse. Thinking of the power, this time you are sure it is fleeting, of what lurks around the corner.
Wonderful imagery, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about the struggles of coming to terms with such a deep trauma as that which can stem from an experience like sexual assault. And I think it tries to at least speak to some of the pain and suffering that can come from having to come to terms with that.
I'm always impressed with how you can put your empathy into words in this way. Hanna, as someone who is so close to these issues and worked so hard on these issues, is Zachary right that we're kind of standing in place over the last few years? Have we made progress? What have you seen since you've talked to us last 3 years ago?
Yeah. First of all, Zachary, that was really incredible. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It made me reflect a lot, actually, on my last few years. A little bit like I shared my testimony at City Council recently. Like when I started on this journey, I really didn't know where I was going. I told myself that I was just to remain open, and as each new thing came in front of me, that I'd assess it for what it is and make a decision, on how to move forward with it, piece by piece. And I've held true to that. But what that's meant for me over the last 3 years has been a lot of things. It has been incredibly difficult at times. Me, tearing into old wounds, just like Zachary's poem, mentioned. But I've also learned a tremendous amount. I've learned so much about our system, and about, what my assault meant to me because of the system that it fell into. As you know, I am one of the 15 plaintiffs that have brought suit against the city of Austin and Travis County district attorneys. And over these last few years, we've made a lot of progress and got to a place where we have come to settlement agreement with them, which brings a lot of hope with some of the terms that we want to see implemented with that settlement. Everything from changes to staffing and training to data transparency and changes to survivor notification procedures. So at the end of the journey that I've been on, I want to look back and feel that it's all been worth it, although it's been very difficult, and also knowing that there's a lot of change that still needs to continue to happen as we move forward.
And I'm so glad, Hanna, you brought up this major settlement between the 15 plaintiffs, including yourself, and the city of Austin. Alison, as the city council person who really, I think, took the lead on many of these issues, can you explain to us what the settlement is and your sense of what effects it will have?
So, as Hannah mentioned, the city was sued by 15 plaintiffs across 2 lawsuits. And last week, we officially settled those lawsuits through a unanimous vote of council. And there's 2 parts of it. The suit alleged mishandling by APD and the district attorney. And this settlement provides some financial remuneration for the victims, for the plaintiffs. And then it also invests several $1 million into policy changes, some of which we have been working on for many years and others that'll be new. So it's about $4 million in policy improvements, and about $1 million of that is still forthcoming to be made by the city. And those things cover a range of needs that we have to improve our sexual assault response system. There are things like adding staffing, which is stuff that we've done for the sex crimes unit, for victim services, changing policies so that you have soft interview rooms, you allow third parties to sit in the interviews, notification protocol improvements, training improvements, community participation improvements, etc. We have also are implementing laptops for all sex crimes detectives, adding some different kinds of staffing to make sure that the process and the data tracking, et cetera, are moving forward, and extensive increases in training for our sex crimes unit, as well as community participation. And then we have a compliance mechanism to make sure this is not a one-off change.
And that comes with an admission of responsibility on the part of the city, yes?
Yes, absolutely. That is something that's really important. There will be an apology from the city. And I think that at last week's meeting, it was really important for the council to affirm our commitment to improving this process and recognize that the system had failed these survivors.
Hanna, what is your reaction to these very substantive measures that Alison has laid out and pushed for? Do you think these will address the main issues, or how do you react to them?
The way I react is that it's the start, right? We have been failing sexual assault survivors for a very long time. And so I think this is the first of many changes that need to happen. And I believe that we did all that we could in this current lawsuit to take it as far as we could in that regard. The area that I continue to look at and worry about, quite frankly, is really the culture in which these changes take place. We can implement policy and procedure, but if there really isn't buy-in on those same policies and procedures won't be enforced go forward. And so I do feel strongly about that compliance component that Councilmember Alter mentions. And so I'm trying to remain optimistic, yet the advocate in me continues to want to fight for more and better as we continue to move forward.
And Hanna, if I might follow up on your really important point on culture, it's exactly the issue we wanted to talk about. What do you see as the challenges in our culture? And I assume you're talking not just about Austin here, but issues that are much larger, probably common in many communities for our listeners.
Yeah. And in order to answer that, I look at this in actually multiple pieces, one of three. And I think one thing that's really important in understanding this issue of sexual assault is first understanding the history and how we got here. And that's specifically around women's history and gender inequality. And when we look back less than 200 years ago, women were actually property of men. First to our fathers, and then secondarily to the husbands that we were married off to. And if a woman was raped back then, it was actually considered property damage of the male that owned them, not a crime against the woman. And it wasn't until the 1900s that women could actually own their own property, and it wasn't actually until 1993 that the final state here in the United States declared that rape in marriage was illegal. And so understanding the culture change, I think, is a much bigger issue at hand. It involves history. It involves our current society of how women are portrayed in media and in movies and in commercials. And it includes our society and how it fosters toxic beliefs that men carry and walk around with, whether that is their inability to express deep hurt or pain without shame, them being encouraged to solve problems through violence, or even finding status in things like money or power and control or sexual conquest. So all of those pieces are part of our current culture, and it's not a simple fix, but they are alive and well in this issue.
And Hanna, how do you see those deeper cultural issues in our society as a whole reflected in the institutions of government and law enforcement that are tasked with responding to and prosecuting sexual assault?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look at our police departments, they are disproportionately run and led by men. And the crime of sexual assault is largely committed by men against women. Not 100% of the time, but very often, 90+% of the time. And so right in that context, it pulls in some of that history and that societal component that's alive and well. And so, I reflect on that a lot and believe that we need to continue to enforce, and look for change at a much deeper level.
Alison, what are your thoughts on that? Both the very male dominated and should we say sometimes hyper masculine nature of policing in Austin and most cities in the United States, and also the bureaucratic elements of this too that often get in the way that I think were implied in Hanna's answer as well.
Absolutely, there are biases that have been created over time within the system. What's important, though, to note is that the system has so many different pieces that impact the experience of someone who's going through this as a survivor. And if you cannot relate to the violence and the trauma that they've experienced, which is, I think, harder for men to do when we're talking about the violation of women in this very personal way. And as Hanna mentioned, it's not just women. You see things that happen in the process that ignore the experience of the survivor just from an experience going through the trauma of the aftermath. And that also leads to things that don't happen in the prosecution. So from the time that 911 is called all the way through until there is or isn't a DA prosecution, at every step, what we found was that the system didn't really think about it from the perspective of the survivor, and the survivor was a woman. The system was set up largely by men.
Right. And this is a theme that we've discussed so often on this podcast, the importance of developing empathy, of learning to understand through historical investigation. And Hanna gave us a great description of this, how our institutions have evolved over time and how individuals are treated by those institutions, and to be able to see that from their point of view, not just our own. Hanna, what do you think we need to do to create more empathy among citizens in general, who still have trouble in many cases identifying with the experience you have had and so many other women and men?
Yeah. I think awareness and understanding is certainly a first step. I think we have got to continue to make this a conversation that is safe, because I truly believe that sexual assault has and is affecting everyone in our nation, whether they know it or not. If you're not a victim, you certainly know victims, whether it's husbands of victims or friends or parents or siblings. We're all affected by it. And I think the first thing that we've got to be able to do is create a safe space to be able to start having the conversations, knowing that there's going to be discomfort. But we've got to be able to move through that discomfort and allow this to be a conversation that we can have much more often.
Jeremi, if I can add
Please.
that, part of what I learned through this process was really the importance of listening. The women who came forward as the plaintiffs were brave beyond belief in sharing their stories, sharing their traumas, and showing it up to the light so that the rest of us could hear. And part of how you get empathy is you have to listen, and you have to be able to admit there's a problem that needs solving, and to figure out what is your role in solving that. What we had to come to grips with as a city council and as a city is that the trust of our community was broken. These women had been failed by the system, and we are trying to put the system back together in a way so that no person has to experience sexual assault and then spend years advocating to be heard. Instead, they will be believed, they will be treated with dignity, their trauma will be recognized, and we will work through the systems of justice and the protections and various things that we have so that justice can be delivered. And if there are perpetrators out there, that they can't go out and do it again.
And I want to follow up on that, Alison, and talk about what we can learn going forward, just as you started to articulate so well, for various parts of our country and other countries too. But before we do that, I just wanted to come back to Hanna on one more thing. How should we address cases where, especially when they're public cases, and we can think of many, where there really is a he said, she said, where there are radically conflicting accounts? We can all think of many very public examples of this. How should we have a productive discourse that doesn't just fall into what I think we've had so far, which is where people just choose sides based on who they like more?
Right. I think many cases have much more evidence than we want to believe. And I think that is where the system has actually failed us up until this point. I think it's been very rare that cases have been taken seriously and thorough investigations are being done so that adequate evidence can even be identified and brought forward. Whether that's thorough, review of crime scenes to gather such evidence, follow up with witnesses, ensuring that rape kits are tested timely. On top of all that, though, I hear you're getting at that consent defense issue. And I do believe with the right training and the right skill and the right intention, the interviewing of perpetrators and victims can look very different and have a very skilled approach to it that can help overcome that consent defense.
Right. And it seems like that would involve a lot of training and a lot of experience, which, again, many, as you pointed out, in this culture don't have and are not open to in all cases. So Alison, coming back then to your excellent points on policy, not just what have you learned about listening, but what have you learned about policy making, and what can we take forward from the experience, the history that you and Hanna have shared for improving things, especially improving our culture, as Hanna highlighted for us?
Well, from the policy system perspective, it's really understanding the complexity and the interactions. In order to get to the point where we're at, we have to look at everything from when that 911 call was made all the way through who was occupying the DA's office. And the women who were involved as the plaintiffs also pushed to change our DA. And that has helped on the other end of the process. And their sex crimes unit, as Hanna just said, they need to be trained in the interviewing. All of those pieces have to happen. You have to have a space where you're interviewing. The detectives have to have a laptop so they can go out, in the scene and be working on their cases out there. There are just so many interconnected things, and the system can be broken without it being any one person's fault or it being intentional. But I think the system can also change with enough push. The lawsuit was one push. We had DNA evidence that was tampered with in a lab that was closed before that. We had the exceptional clearance data revealed by ProPublica and other sources. You need everyone. It's, the media, it's council members taking this up. It's staff on our end who are listening to the lawsuit and trying to find ways forward that really address the core of the plaintiff's concern, which was never the remuneration and was much more about how do we make this so no other person has to go through this. All of those things come together, and you really have to look at the whole system. You have to listen carefully and find, how do we change this and what are the levers? And when you think something's been done, it often isn't, and you got to keep trying and keep going at it from another direction and triangulate it until you actually get big change.
That's so important, Alison. I wonder if we could be a little more specific, though. So how do we get those who investigate these crimes to take them more seriously? How do we get the public to take this more seriously? How do we find the resources systematically to do this?
Well, first of all, is you have to understand that there are ways to do this better than others. And a detective who's never been trained can't do better until they're trained. And so you have to understand that if you want the system to work better, you have to make investments. Some of these investments in the scheme of the city are not that huge, but the issue is that you have to make the right investments and you have to have the right people in place who understand there needs to be a culture change. Not only do we have a new DA, we have a new chief. And while I didn't vote for his confirmation, I've pushed really hard on him to improve his response to sexual assault, as did my colleagues, and I think he's listening to that. You have to change, who's commanding the sex crimes unit. You have to elevate the person who's in charge of victim services. All of these pieces have to come together, and everyone has to be moving in a single direction to provide this justice and healing.
Hanna, in terms of changing the culture of our society and our city, do you think there's an opportunity to start young, to get young people like myself talking about issues of consent from a young age?
Oh my gosh, yes. I think that's where it has to start, right? And continue to grow this with the youth. There's opportunity at very young ages to help young kids, much younger than yourself, Zachary, to understand what appropriate boundaries look like and appropriate consent looks like for their age appropriateness. It's also been very difficult to actually bring a lot of this conversation into the school systems. It's one that is, I don't want to say controversial, but there's a lot of opinions about how it should be taught. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I also think that it's one that has its own challenges that we've got to figure out how to continue to work through, knowing that there are a lot of different opinions around this issue and how we engage with our youth on it.
I think that's so well said. Alison, what measures has the city taken with regard to education, and what have you learned in that space?
Well, if I have to say an area that we have not done enough, that would be in terms of stopping sexual assault from happening in the first place. Because of the lawsuits, because of what we learned about the response system, we've been really focused on that piece. But it'd be much better to stop the sexual assaults from happening in the first place. We do have programs in our schools, but it's never enough given the messages that Hanna was talking about before that are expressed throughout our society and that men in particular absorb.
And what about public education, Alison? Is there a way, and I mean public education not in schools, I mean in terms of public awareness. Do you have a public awareness policy around this?
Our public health department may have programs that they work on in the schools that I'm not aware of, but we have not launched that kind of program yet. But that would certainly be a next step that we should be considering in terms of awareness, just as we're launching gun safety programs and different programs for our violence prevention programs. There are opportunities with respect to sexual assault, respect to domestic violence that we should be investing more into.
And I love that answer, because I think one of our points week in and week out in this podcast is that when you look at the history of our democracy, as you and Hanna have so well in this discussion, you see there actually are more opportunities than we realize, that we sometimes get stuck in bottlenecks and grooves of recurring debates and underexplore what Franklin Roosevelt would call the many different elements of our democracy that can be involved in raising awareness and teaching people and providing support. And I think that just the way that this conversation has ranged, beyond policing to include health and schools, I think that's so instructive. Hanna, we always like to close with an optimistic note, using this history to go forward. What are you most eager and excited to see in terms of further progress in the next, I hope it's not 3 years before we have you on again. Let's say 1 year. What do you hope to see?
Yeah. I really hope that the settlement and the lawsuit that we brought forward, I think for all the right reasons, continues to see all the right changes that we hoped that it did and will continue to make going forward. I personally hope to move into more of the space that we've been talking about today, and that is dialoguing with community around this issue and being able to come at it from a deeper, more personal level rather than policy, albeit policy is still incredibly important. So that's where I'm continuing to look at the current stage. I've also, through this journey, have written a memoir. So I'm in the process of learning that whole world of how to publish a book that I've written largely on my experience as a survivor and as an advocate.
Wow. Well, we hope to have you on to talk about your book and to learn from your book. Alison, what are you hopeful for in the next year, particularly from the perspective of a municipal policymaker?
Well, first, I hope that the survivors, the plaintiffs who were brave enough to sue the city and the district attorney in the county get a measure of healing from the settlements that we were able to reach, and that they can reflect on how the actions that they took, their willingness to speak up and share their stories, their persistence in pushing elected officials and policymakers, that is making a difference in many people's lives. So I think that's one. Of course, I hope that all of our reforms get implemented. We will also be getting a study back that we initiated for a comprehensive evaluation that will have further policy reforms in it. I hope we will implement those. But I hope that we can be a model for other cities so that other cities can recognize that they have a problem, that they can improve their response to sexual assault so that it delivers healing and justice, that they can take on this system by collaborating with survivors, with other parts of government, and really examine and say, we have a problem, how do we fix it? And learn from all of the information that's out there of the many ways that we can improve our system. Then, as you added, in our discussion of education, I think we need to see what is the city's role in stopping sexual assault from happening in the first place. There's certainly a connection between finding the perpetrators and people being held accountable and to people feeling comfortable reporting. But what are the other ways that we as a city can think about how we stop the violence in the first place? We've been talking a lot about that next step of what happens after the assault. But what can we do? Because no one should experience sexual assault in the first place.
Zachary, I think that opens up your space here in particular. How do young people respond to this, and what are the ways in which young people can be more participatory? I hear Alison saying we need a more participatory approach. I hear Hanna saying we have to not just think about this in old ways. Clearly, this puts a lot of onus on younger people who are coming into the system. How do you see this from that perspective?
I think young people have really already, in many cases, embraced this new understanding of the origins of sexual violence and the deeper cultural problems that promote it. I think that the problem is that we're not really addressed at a mature level from a young age. I think that too much of our sex ed education is centered around obscuring the truth or trying to sugarcoat the harsher realities of the adult world. And I think that to a certain extent, young people are sort of thrust into into these cultures and institutions that don't really understand them, and that they've never really been taught to understand. And I think that's really where a lot of these problems are coming from.
Right. Hanna, last question to you, just following up Zachary's point. How can young people who don't want things sugarcoated and obscured, as Zachary described so well, how can they take ownership themselves? How can they get involved?
Yeah, I would love to keep hearing that. Keep hearing those words that Zachary just said from our youth. They need to keep raising their voices and saying that they see it differently and they want to hear it, the reality of it. I think that opens up the older generation's eyes and approaches to reconsider maybe how they've been trying to deliver those messages in the past. So I just encourage our youth to keep speaking up. I encourage our current generation to start looking at this issue with a different lens, understanding that where we came from and history matters. But in order for us to actually get to the change that we want, we're going to have to change the way we're doing things today.
And Alison, as a political leader, who faces crosswinds from different priorities. There are many people who don't like it when the police are criticized, for example. How do you see young people helping as we go forward?
I think young people have an opportunity to help those of us who are older to recognize where there are real problems that we may not have noticed before, that we should have noticed. Sexual assault, we think in Texas, affects 2 out of 5 people. So it's a real problem, but a lot of people go through their life not recognizing it. The use of force, other things, saying, that's not right. We can do things differently. There's got to be a better way. That willingness to look at situations and shed light on them in different ways is and can be extremely powerful.
And how do we make young people feel like the political system matters for them in that way, Alison? That they should voice their words and their perspective that way?
Well, some of the women in the settlement, were assaulted at really young ages and have been pushing and pushing. And, they have made a whole city and a county recognize that the system didn't serve them well and have made change happen.
It's inspiring. And I think Hanna and Alison, you are inspiring. I hope all of our listeners take away. Again, it's a central message of our podcast each week, but it's more relevant and more effectively transmitted in your discussion today than in any other week. I think the importance of people having their voices heard, making their voices heard, pushing their voices to be heard, especially young people who have such valuable perspectives and are so essential to the growth of our democracy. Hanna and Alison, we want to thank you for all the work you've done and for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Zachary, of course, thank you for your poem and for your reflections as well. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.